I just recently heard Russell Moore, who he's just a really sharp guy and has talked a lot about kind of where we are at in our nation right now in relationship to church and religion, and I really respect a lot of the work that he's done. But recently he was talking about how in his town there's an abandoned clubhouse, and it was the Lions Clubhouse where the Lions Club would meet and they would hold fundraisers and they would collect glasses that people weren't using, and they would give those glasses to the poor, and they would take the money from the fundraisers that they had put together and donate it to the school and needs in the community. We still have a Lions Club here in Chandler that does a lot of those things. But in his community, the Lions Club had their own clubhouse, and the clubhouse is abandoned now because the Lions Club is no more. Everyone that was in the club either passed away or has gotten into bad health or in the nursing home or something along those lines. And he said that kind of the story in his community is the story of most communities, that there were organizations, clubs in those communities that have just kind of faded away as the generation that participated in those things has passed on. And he said that a lot of people will tell you that what we've replaced it with now are Facebook groups. That now we have these groups or clubs online. And he said, my community also has a Facebook group. It's the Citizens of, and it has his town name. And he said, and what it is it's people acting anything but a citizen. It's just people arguing and bickering, right? And if you've been on Facebook and you've been in one of these groups, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's not something that is greatly beneficial to the community, right? It's a lot of drama, right? And the difference between that club in his community that made all of this difference in the community and what happens on Facebook is that for that club to function, there had to be a group of people who were committed and consistent, who showed up and they did the work. They made the soup that was sold to raise the funds. They collected the glasses, right? There were people who showed up on a consistent basis and they committed to do the work. Now, there are some Facebook groups that people have used as a great tool to organize and see some really great things done. And what's true about every one of those instances is that there is a group of people within that group that is committed and consistent and constantly points people back towards what the group was founded for. But if it's just a group where people can come in and they can say whatever they want and then they can bounce, it's not going to be conducive to anything beneficial because there's no consistency and there's no commitment. And what I want you to see in the passage of Scripture that we're going to study today is that for formation to happen, for there to be this change that happens in us that then bleeds out into our community, that flows out into our community, there must be consistency and there must be commitment. A lot of people have spoken on this topic and how things have changed here in our nation. One of them being Robert Putnam, who wrote the book that was kind of a big deal to people who watched what was happening in culture. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, and he talked about how it used to be that people would bowl in groups. They would bowl on a team. Now the majority of times people are bowling just one or two people. There's lots of people bowling alone. That was not something that happened back in the day. But people don't want to be committed to a league. They want to just come and bowl when they want to bowl. What we see is that there has to be this consistency and commitment. Now, before I get started, I want to be clear with you about those words because it could be that you hear consistency and commitment and they have a negative vibe to you. And like, oh man, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. Because we live in a culture of freedom. We live in a culture where freedom has been lifted up as the ideal, and because of that, words like consistency and commitment are seen as an opposite of being free to do what you want, when you want, with who you want. The letter that we're reading today is a letter that talks about consistency and commitment, but it doesn't speak of it in terms of drudgery or simply duty. Because Philippians is known as the letter of joy. Paul would use the word joy 16 times across these 4 chapters. And it's not written as the letter of joy because of where it's written from or because of where it's written to. Because Paul writes the letter of Philippians from jail. He's been imprisoned for preaching the gospel, and he writes the letter of Philippians to a group of believers in the city of Philippi who are in a city that is opposed to the gospel. A city where when Paul was there originally, he was thrown in prison there as well. A city where there is great demonic activity. A city where they are going to be in the minority and there's going to be opposition to what they're proclaiming about Jesus. So how is it that Paul, writing from prison to people who are in an oppositional culture, a culture that is not on their side but is opposed to them, how is it that this is a letter of joy? You see, the difference is that he can write about joy because joy is not happiness. It's different. Okay? We spend our lives looking for happiness when what we should be seeking is joy. You see, the word happiness, it comes from the root, which is hap, the root word hap. And that comes from an Old Norse word which means luck or chance or fate or fortune. And that fits because happiness depends on your fortune or your luck. It depends on how lucky you are, how great things are currently going. And if things are going great, you're happy. If happenstance is that things are great, great. If your circumstances are good, you're happy. And because we live our lives looking for happiness, we do everything we can to try and craft our circumstances to where they will make us the most happy. Where they are free from inconvenience, free from anything that hinders what we want to do. That way we can be the most happy. But what Paul is talking about in this letter is not happiness that depends upon happenstance, but rather joy, which is resilient. Joy is resilient because joy does not depend upon circumstances. Paul would write in this letter rather extensively about how you can have joy in the worst of circumstances. When things are not great, when things are the worst, you can still have joy. And what he would show them is that joy can only come from God. Happiness, you can get it from the right happenstance or circumstance, but joy you can only get from God. And we best experience joy from God when we are walking with Him consistently. So when you hear the words consistency and commitment this morning in my sermon, I don't want you to have the feeling that I wake up with every morning when it's time to go to the gym. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to go, but I have to go. I need to go. The only way that I can stay in the somewhat decent shape that I'm in is if I go. I have to go. If I don't go, Michael will make fun of me. I have to go. They will give me a hard time when I eventually do go back, right? I don't go because I want to go. I go because I need to go. And I want you to hear that I'm not talking about consistency or commitment in those terms this morning. I'm talking about consistency and commitment in terms of joy. Joy and goodness, graciousness. Let me show you what I mean in the first verses of this chapter. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Here in these first two verses are a couple of ideas that aren't popular in our culture today, that kind of fly in the face of what we think in our modern culture, what we think will bring about goodness or happiness or joy. First of all, Paul calls himself and Timothy bondservants. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ. Now, Paul is currently in bondage. He's in prison. Okay? But Timothy is not. Timothy is not in prison when Paul writes this letter. And so the point here is not prisoners of the Lord in the sense that we've been imprisoned, but rather Paul and Timothy have chosen to serve Jesus. They have bound themselves to serving God. He's not referring to bonds that they did not choose, but rather bonds that they chose. They've chosen to be servants. Now, Paul is playing off of this idea that he isn't currently imprisoned, and that's going to be a major theme throughout the entire book that he's about to go into as he talks about how to have joy in the worst of circumstances. And he has joy even in difficult circumstances that he didn't choose. But right here, as he's writing this letter and he's introducing himself, it's kind of this opening greeting. He refers to himself as a bondservant, and it's a bondage or a servitude that he chose. When Paul calls himself here, is not really a slave. What Paul calls himself is someone who has willingly joined themselves to a person, to a master, because they want to or because they feel compelled to. Now, the idea of slavery has negative connotation in our minds, and it should. Because when we think of slavery, we think of people who were kidnapped and forced into unwilling servitude. Forced into it. But what Paul is talking about here is that he has signed up for this. He has chosen this. He wants to be about this. He has committed his life to serving God. Paul and Timothy decided that they would commit their lives to building the church. They weren't forced into it, but rather they were compelled. And even though it was incredibly challenging, they found great joy in it. They committed to serve God, and it brought them great joy. In the marriage class that I'm leading on Wednesday evenings, this past week we looked at connection and how couples are connected, and they had the video that we showed had an expert who was talking about it's a very modern notion for us today to think of love as something that you fall into and fall out of, rather than something that you choose and commit to. And he talked about how when they've had couples who are about to split up, and they've been able to convince them to give it another try and to pursue one another again, that the love that they have on the far side of that is greater than what they had before. That it's not something that is just infatuation, but it's a commitment that they have. And they have greater joy and meaning and purpose in their marriage on the far side of it. Paul and Timothy have chosen to walk with God, and even though that has led them into some very difficult circumstances, they have great joy on the far side of it. And as he would write about in this book, his joy is magnified or expanded or multiplied after going through these hard times when there are more people who come to know Jesus as a result, like in Philippi, where these people are. So the first thing that we see here is kind of not super popular in modern ideas is the idea of a bondservant. The second is that he greets all the saints in Philippi. So he's talking to all the Christians, all the people who've been made righteous. And I know that when you hear the word saint, perhaps because of our Catholic region and culture, you think of people who were super holy and they're dead. But that's not what he's talking about. When we use the word saint, we're not talking about someone who is super holy and they've died, and now we revere them and remember them. When we talk about saints, we think of messed up, ordinary people like you who Jesus has forgiven and made righteous. We are saints. And I know that the world might not think that we're saints, and they don't have any reason to think that we're saints, but we know that we're saints because of what Jesus has done. And so he's writing to all of the saints, all of the Christians in Philippi, all the people who have put their faith in Jesus and have come to belong to the Philippi church. And he then references specifically the bishops and the deacons, or the elders and the overseers of the church. And I think that most people would be like, oh, organized religion. A common refrain we hear these days is that people are spiritual, but they don't want any part of organized religion, right? And honestly, I get where they're coming from, because I've been around organized religion, and it's got problems, right? I mean, I'm part of a church right now, and I know it's got problems. Paul knew it too. Paul knew that organized religion had problems. Paul knew that the church had problems because every church, every church that Paul established, even churches that had people in them who walked literally with Jesus, saw Jesus raised from the dead, even those people that we would call the other type of saint, even those churches were messed up and had problems. Even those guys who were with Jesus in the upper room weren't perfect. They had issues. And so read the New Testament, you have letter after letter that Paul writes to these churches trying to fix them, trying to straighten them out, trying to correct heresy and rebuke sin that's being overlooked. Paul knew this. And yet every city he goes to, he preaches the gospel, and before he leaves, he establishes new leadership for a new church. Why? Because Paul knew that even with its flaws, that the church was the place where there would be space for new people to experience Jesus, and for people who knew Jesus and were walking with him to have greater sanctification, to become more and more like Jesus. You see, people say, man, I wish we could just keep it simple, just make it about Jesus and not get hung up on all this other stuff. Why do we even need the church, right? I like what I heard Russell Johnson say recently. He said every roof he's ever had needed work. If you've owned a home for any period of time, you probably need to have some work done on your roof, right? And if you haven't, you probably need to right now. You need to have some work done on your roof. Every roof I've ever had has needed work. Has needed to be patched, has had a leak. We've got a spot here in the church that ever since we had the roof replaced after that hailstorm about 13 years ago, it just hasn't been quite right. And 2 years ago, we had it worked on again, and it hasn't leaked since then. Awesome, right? Well, then we had all that snow and ice a month ago, you remember? And it kind of formed a dam, and so the water backed up and it leaked, and it's messed up one of the walls in the growth track room again, right? That's super frustrating. Like, it was really frustrating to come in that Sunday morning and say, oh man, it's leaking again? But you know what I didn't say? I am so sick and tired of this roof. Just take it off. Just take it off. No more roof. Listen, the structure and the organization of the church is a mess, and that means we've got to constantly be working on it, pointing out the issues, facing the problems, patching the leaks, fixing the sagging beams, replacing the rotten decking, replacing the shingles. But we can't go without a roof. And the only person who would say, you know what, just get rid of the roof. Why do we need it? The only person who would say that is someone who hasn't experienced the shelter and warmth that a roof provides. And you know why many people in our community say, what do you even need the church for? Why can't we just focus on Jesus and go out and be in nature and experience God? What do you need the church for? People who feel that way have never experienced what a healthy, life-giving, gospel-centered, Jesus-focused, authentic community church is. You know why they don't think we need it? Because they've never experienced the good one. Everywhere Paul went, he didn't just preach the gospel and leave. It would have been a lot easier. You know why Paul got imprisoned all the time? It's because he stayed. If he just preached the gospel and bounced, he'd have been fine. He could just hey, you guys need to get right with Jesus. You're going to die and you're going to face your sin. You need to go and put your faith in Jesus Christ. Now, see ya. And they wouldn't have been able to arrest him. He could have just constantly stayed ahead of them. Why did he stick around? Why did he stick around in places where they threatened him, if you don't stop, we're going to arrest you? Why did he stay? And every place that he stayed long enough to get a church established. So there'd be a roof over the Christians, over those new believers. A place where they could gather and know Jesus and know His Word and encourage one another and reach out to others. He knew the difference that community could make in that town. You see, if you've experienced the shelter and the warmth that a good roof provides, you know that it's worth the maintenance. You know it's worth the new shingles. Man, I hated to hear that Gene Hackman died this week. A ton of great movies. And I was reminded when I heard of his passing of Hoosiers. And so this past weekend, I watched Hoosiers with my kids. If you've never seen that movie, classic movie. He's a basketball coach here in Indiana in 1951. And as he's the basketball coach, he's also going to teach one of the classes. And there's a scene in the movie where he has one of his students up reading a poem that he's written. And the kid is talking about progress in the poem. It's 1951, remember? And the kid talks about the progress of indoor plumbing. And there were a lot of things about that movie that my kids just did not get. But I'm sure they didn't get that one. Indoor plumbing being progress, right? But in 1951, hey, this is pretty great. If you've never experienced indoor plumbing, who needs that? If that's all you've known, why would we go anywhere that doesn't have it? You want to go camping? You want to stay in a tent? Why? Why do you want to do that? I like the shelter and warmth of a roof and a place where I can turn a faucet on and just water comes out. And all these water come out, but it's warm. This is great. If you've experienced that, you know how good it is. Paul experienced it and he wanted it for other people. And so he established structure in Philippi like he did every other city. And so that's what he refers to here in these opening verses. And because he established that structure in Philippi years ago, now that years later he's writing a letter to them, I want you to see the things that he talks about in these opening lines. Because of that structure, because it's there, I want you to look at what he's able to say to them next. Look at verse 3. I thank God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you all with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace. For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and discernment, and that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense until the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. You know what? He used the word you a lot in there. But remember, he told us in the opening lines that this letter is to all the saints. And if Paul was from Alabama, like Pastor Dustin, he might have said y'all in all of those places. If he was from Virginia like me, it might have been you guys. If he was from Southern Illinois, it might be you ones. But he's talking plural. The you is not just you, it's you. It's all of them. And he has affection for them all. And he's praying that they all experience grace and love and peace and wisdom and excellence. What you see here is not institutionalized religious practices. What you see here is a community of people that love one another and are for one another. You see a beautiful picture of New Testament gospel community. There's no instance in the New Testament where believers weren't expected to be a part of the church. And when you read this and you see them all together, you don't hear the connotation of duty or drudgery. You don't hear stuffy, institutionalized, bureaucratic religion. You hear a group of people who love one another, who are experiencing joy and fellowship and love and grace and wisdom and excellence. The leaders that Paul had established before leaving, they were simply making space for this love, fellowship, growth, all of it to abound more and more. And when I say that they were establishing space, I don't mean real estate. I don't mean square footage. When I talk about a roof, I'm not talking about shingles. I'm talking about a place where you're known and you're cared for and you're encouraged and you're held accountable. That's what they had created, and that's what they were experienced. What Paul had established and he continues to care for and nurture and pray for, even though he's no longer in Philippi, he cares for that church and he wants to see the people in it grow and become more and more like Jesus. He's praying for them, and he's praying that they would experience more and more of God's goodness, and that goodness, as they experience it, would produce fruits of righteousness, he says in verse 11. Being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. You know what he's praying? He's praying that it multiplies, that it expands exponentially. That what started in one life becomes a movement in multiple lives. What happened in one family multiplies and is exponentially spreading into many families. That's what he's hoping for. And what we see here in this passage of Scripture is that this church, this gathering of saints in Philippi, this gathering of real people like you and me just 2,000 years ago, that it wasn't just some event. It wasn't just a time on the weekly calendar. It was a community. And the community was a hospital. Not a nursing home, a hospital. At the nursing home in Moveville, I can remember there were a couple people in the congregation that they went there after maybe a hospital stay. And I would say, which side are they on? Because there's the rehab side, and then there's just the convalescent care side. There's the side where they're going to try to get you back on your feet so you can go home, and there's a side where they recognize you're probably just going to be here. What Paul is describing is a place of love and grace and unity, but it's also a place where people are going to be changed. It's the rehab side. It's not just comfort care. It's not we're going to keep you comfortable till you die. There's going to be some transformation that happens. We want to see fruits under righteousness that multiplies more and more and more. You took 5 steps today, let's take 8 tomorrow. God is not working for our comfort and ease. He's working toward our growth. But this growth is good and lovely. It's not drudgery. It's beautiful. In Desert Storm, there were multiple ships in the Gulf supporting the war effort. Multiple warships. But there was also one cruise ship that was brought in. You see, the Pentagon chartered this British luxury liner called the Cunard Princess. And its only reason for being in the Gulf is that when soldiers would rotate on to leave, there was this cruise ship that they could go to, and they could swim in the pool, and they could drink, and whatever. It was a place where they could have R&R. So you've got all these warships, and then you've got the British luxury liner. And troops would get 3 days there to pretend that they weren't at war. We are not a luxury liner. This is not a cruise ship. This is a warship. But it's a worship you don't need a break from. It's a worship that it is a good place. It is wholesome. It is a place of grace. It is a place of mercy. It is a place of love. We aren't a cruise ship, we're a warship, but we're the kind of worship you don't need respite from because we're a life-giving worship. We're not a life-taking worship. We're not crushing. We're not bruising and battering. We're taking ground. We're doing it with love. We're doing it with grace. We're doing it with mercy. We are pushing back the kingdom of evil. The gates of hell will not prevail against God's church that is founded upon Jesus Christ. But we are not doing it by crushing people and abusing people. We are doing it by lifting them up. Jesus said, I have come and I will not bruise a reed. I'll lift them up. So Paul is not praying for the Philippians to be safe. He's not praying for them to be comfortable. But he is praying for them to experience love and grace and joy and wisdom and excellence. So much so that it brings about fruits of righteousness. Remember what we talked about last week? We talked about being like that tree that's planted by the river. Not like the shrub in the desert, but the tree planted by the river. A place that produces fruit. No matter the circumstances or the season. No matter the wind. It has that consistent supply. And I think that we often don't realize how that's produced. The whole purpose of this sermon series is how does formation happen? How does this fruit get produced in our lives? It's by being in a place consistently committed to what it is that God has called us to be a part of. Recently, I read the story of this contractor. He was doing some work on this family's home, and he had hired several workers to work with him, and some of those workers didn't speak English. And so the people who owned the home, they said, hey, listen, we need to talk to you about some of your guys. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, what happened? What's wrong? They said, that one guy, he took an apple off of that tree over there, and he ate it. He said, oh, I'm sorry, we should have asked permission. And they said, no, that's not a store apple. He said, I don't know what you mean. He goes, those apples aren't for eating. That's on a tree. They shouldn't be eating that. And he said, why did you plant the tree? Oh, because it looks beautiful. But those aren't apples for eating. And the contractor realized they don't know where apples come from. They think that apples come from a store. That there's a factory that produces them, and then you go to a store and you buy them. They don't grow on a tree. He finally just said, yeah, I'll talk to him. I'll let him know. Where does formation happen? It happens by being planted by the river of water. And it takes time. And God brings about this transformation in us, and there's formation. Why did Paul establish these churches in places like Philippi? Why did he stick around in a place that had put him in prison and God had to miraculously free him from prison, and then he stayed again? Why did he stay? So he could establish a church with deacons and elders and overseers so that there could be a new source of life in that city. He says, I'm praying that there are fruits unto righteousness among you. You know what our church is to be like? We're to be like a faucet. A faucet that you turn on and there's water. And we don't produce the water. but we're connected to the source. We're connected to where it comes from. We're connected to where it is. And we're formed. We have the fruits of righteousness, the fruits of the Spirit, the works of God in us. And as we are formed, we become rich in God. And friend, there's plenty to go around. We had a water main break in Chandler this week. No water. Turn on the faucet. It's nothing. They got to fix the pipe. There is no shortage of supply from heaven. There is no water main break. If we are willing to be connected and planted in Him. And as we are formed, we have the fruits of righteousness, the fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of the works of God in us. So let's be formed up into pillars and posts that can be joined together to provide shelter, to provide a place that people can come off of the road, out of their weariness, out of their heartbreak, out of their loneliness, experience the life-giving, encouraging, refreshing, emboldening goodness of God. You might have heard someone say that you could be the only Bible that some people will ever read. And really, that's just a way of saying that you could be the only transformation that some people ever see. You'll be the only person truly changed deep down in the very marrow of your soul that some people ever come across. What did Paul establish in Philippi? He established a church made up of ordinary people who became pillars that held a roof, that made space. And it doesn't tell us the names of these people. But I like to think that we know who one of them is. Because if you read Acts 16, you read the story of when Paul and Silas first go to Philippi and they're thrown in prison. And they've been beaten and thrown in prison and put in stocks and bonds. They're shackled. And the Bible tells us that in the night they sang hymns. And while they're singing, after being beaten and imprisoned, an earthquake comes and it shakes the prison and all of the doors open. And the guard is about to kill himself. He's about to thrust himself on his sword. And Paul says, "Do yourself no harm, for we are still here." And the man comes to them and says, "What must I do to be saved?" And Paul and Silas baptize he and his family that night. I like to think that one of the deacons or elders in the Philippi church that he's greeting there is that jailer who heard Paul and Silas singing in the night, who saw they had a joy that wasn't dependent upon their circumstances. They had a joy that was resilient in the face of being beaten. They had a joy that couldn't be taken. But God forms us. We should have a joy that can't be taken. Brothers and sisters, we are blessed to be in this life-giving river. Do we have that irrepressible joy? That resilient joy? We should. And if we do, it will be a light in our dark, miserable world. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.